My son-in-law had no idea I owned the company he works for as CEO. He always saw me living simply, a quiet old man in a faded tweed jacket who kept to himself. One evening, he invited me to a private dinner with his wealthy parents. I accepted the invitation, wanting to see exactly how they would treat a poor man. They showed their true colors the moment they slid a thick white envelope across the mahogany table, offering to buy my absence from my own daughter's life. 5 minutes later, the foundation of their entire world began to collapse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogance always comes with a heavy, unavoidable price. The icy Brentwater wind bit through the thin fabric of my old tweed jacket as I stood on the pavement outside the city's most exclusive steakhouse. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed past me, opening the doors of sleek European sports cars for men wearing suits that cost more than a reliable used vehicle. I looked down at my scuffed leather boots. They were clean, polished with care, but undeniably worn by decades of use. I had owned these boots for 15 years. I could have bought the entire restaurant with a single phone call, but I chose to wear the boots. I chose to wear the faded jacket. I chose to arrive in a battered pickup truck that I parked 3 blocks away to avoid the sneering staff. I am 69 years old, and I learned a long time ago that wealth is a quiet shield, while ostentation is a loud target. My name is Theodore Marsh, and my life has been defined by 2 things: the logistics empire I built from nothing, and my daughter Adeline. Adeline was the reason I was standing in the freezing cold. She had married Wesley 3 years ago. From the very beginning, I saw through Wesley. I saw the calculated ambition in his eyes, the way he measured a person's worth by the brand of their watch or the cut of their suit. He treated me with a thinly veiled disdain, an exhausting tolerance reserved for someone he considered an unfortunate social burden. He believed I was a retired blue-collar worker, surviving on a meager state pension. He believed my small 2-bedroom suburban house was the absolute limit of my life's achievements. I never corrected him. I wanted Adeline to be loved for who she was, not for the massive trust fund sitting quietly in her name. When Wesley informed me that his parents, Bertram and Priscilla, were flying into town to celebrate his recent promotion to CEO of Sterling Meridian Logistics, he invited me to dinner. The invitation was delivered with a heavy sigh, a clear obligation rather than a genuine desire for my company. I accepted because I needed to know exactly what kind of family my daughter had married into. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The warmth of the lobby washed over me, carrying the rich scent of roasted garlic, seared steak, and expensive perfume. A hostess with a rigid smile looked me up and down, her eyes momentarily lingering on the frayed elbows of my jacket. I gave her Wesley's name, and her forced smile tightened as she led me through the crowded main dining room toward the private suites in the back. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside the private room. The conflict began before a single word was spoken. Bertram and Priscilla sat at the center of the long table. They looked exactly as I had expected. Bertram wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a massive gold watch gleaming on his wrist like a weapon of intimidation. Priscilla wore a silk dress dripping with pearls, her face pulled tight with judgment. Wesley sat beside them, swirling a glass of deep red wine. When I walked in, none of them stood up. Bertram and Priscilla scanned my clothes, their expressions immediately souring into pure, unadulterated contempt. Wesley did not offer his hand. He simply gestured with his wine glass toward the furthest chair at the end of the table, as far away from them as physically possible. Adeline was not in the room. Wesley muttered that she had gone to the restroom to fix her makeup. I pulled out my own chair and sat down in the heavy, suffocating silence. The psychological assault commenced the moment the waiter poured the water. Priscilla leaned forward, resting her diamond-adorned fingers on the white tablecloth. She looked at me with a smile that dripped with condescending pity. She asked how my little house was holding up in the winter, emphasizing the word little, as if she were talking about a doghouse. She complained about how exhausting it was to heat their massive estate in Ashgrove Point. Bertram chimed in loudly, bragging about their recent 3-week vacation on the Ligurian coast. He swirled his wine and looked directly at my scuffed boots. He asked me what exactly I had done for a living before I retired to my quiet, unremarkable life. I looked at him calmly. I kept my voice steady and low. I told him I worked with my hands my whole life. I told him I spent decades managing freight, moving boxes, and dealing with trucks. It was the absolute truth. I just omitted the fact that I eventually owned 10,000 of those trucks. Bertram let out a short, mocking laugh. He glanced at Priscilla, sharing a look of absolute superiority. They immediately labeled me as an uneducated warehouse laborer. Wesley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing red with deep embarrassment. He looked at me as if my mere presence was a stain on his newly acquired corporate status. The tension in the room thickened into something toxic. Every comment Priscilla made about fine dining, luxury cars, and high society connections was a calculated insult designed to establish absolute dominance. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I sat silently drinking my tap water, observing their arrogance with the cold, detached patience of a predator watching its prey step blindly into a trap. The waiter returned, placing expensive cuts of meat and delicate seafood towers on the table. Bertram did not touch his food. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope and placed it squarely on the mahogany table. He pressed his fingers against the paper and slowly slid it across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of my plate. The room fell deathly silent. Wesley stared at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. Priscilla took a delicate sip of her wine, watching me with a predatory smirk. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at Bertram. I asked him what it was. Bertram spoke with brutal, unapologetic bluntness. He told me there was a cashier's check inside for $20,000. He told me it was a relocation fund. The condition of the money was absolute and non-negotiable. I was to invent an excuse about my failing health, or a desire for warmer weather. I was to pack up my pathetic little house and move to a low-tier retirement facility in Coral County, or Verdun State. I was to completely remove myself from Adeline and Wesley's life. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I asked him why I would ever do such a thing. Bertram leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. He stated that Wesley had just been appointed the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Meridian Logistics. He claimed that Wesley was now moving in circles of extreme wealth and influence. He looked at my faded jacket with utter disgust. He told me that my visible poverty, my lack of education, and my lower-class background were social anchors dragging down Wesley's rising trajectory. He said that a man of Wesley's stature could not be seen associating with a man who looked like he belonged in a soup kitchen. I did not touch the envelope. I slowly turned my gaze to Wesley, the boy I had allowed to marry my only daughter, the man who had taken vows to honor and respect our family. I asked Wesley directly if he agreed with his father. I asked him if he truly wanted me to take this money and vanish from my daughter's life. Wesley finally lifted his head. He looked me right in the eye, his face hardened by greed and unchecked ambition. He coldly agreed with his parents. Wesley stated that his career required a certain image. He told me that a corporate executive running a company as massive as Sterling Meridian Logistics simply cannot have a father-in-law who looks like a janitor. He told me to take the money and do what was best for everyone. The ultimate betrayal hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Wesley had completely sold his soul to his own vanity. He had no idea that the massive company he was so proud to run, the corporate empire that gave him this disgusting sense of superiority, was built by the very hands he was insulting. He had no idea that the board of directors who hired him ultimately answered to a blind trust controlled entirely by the man sitting across from him in a frayed tweed jacket. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door clicked open. Adeline walked back into the private dining room, her face bright and completely unaware of the execution that had just taken place. She smiled at me, asking if they had already ordered the appetizers. Before anyone could speak, I reached out and smoothly slid the white envelope into the inner pocket of my jacket. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Bertram and Priscilla exchanged a rapid, victorious glance. Wesley let out a quiet, barely audible sigh of relief. They believed I had surrendered. They believed the poor, pathetic old man had taken the bribe out of sheer desperation. I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, kind-hearted Adeline, who deserved so much better than the cowards sitting at this table. I did not scream. I did not flip the table or cause a public spectacle. Anger is an emotion for the powerless, and I was holding all the power in the world. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and calm. I reached into my pants pocket and pulled out a single crumpled $1 bill. I smoothed it out with my fingers and placed it precisely in the center of my empty plate. I looked directly at Wesley and told him that the dollar was to cover the cost of my tap water. I turned to Adeline, forcing a gentle smile onto my face. I told her I was feeling suddenly unwell, that the winter air had given me a headache, and I needed to go home and rest. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay, to enjoy the evening with her new family. I promised I would call her in the morning. As I pulled away from my daughter, I caught one last glimpse of Bertram. He was smirking, cutting into his expensive steak, with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had just bought the world. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private room. I navigated through the crowded restaurant, the sounds of clinking crystal and wealthy laughter fading behind me. I pushed open the brass doors and stepped out into the freezing Brentwater night. The bitter wind hit my face, but I did not feel the cold. The timid, quiet old man persona I had worn for the past 2 hours instantly vanished. My spine straightened, my eyes narrowed into the darkness of the street. I reached into my pocket, ignoring the envelope filled with Bertram's filthy money, and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed a secure number. The line rang only once before it was answered. Frank Delgado, my corporate attorney and the architect of my blind trust, spoke quietly on the other end. I did not offer a greeting. I spoke with the absolute, terrifying authority of a man going to war. I told Frank that they took the bait. I told him that my son-in-law had crossed the point of no return. I ordered Frank to initiate an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of Wesley's executive accounts at Sterling Meridian Logistics. I ordered him to trace every single dime Wesley had touched since the board appointed him. I stood in the shadows of the street, watching the valet bring a silver Porsche to the front of the restaurant, knowing exactly how this story was going to end. The hunt had officially begun, and I was going to tear their fraudulent kingdom down to the foundation. The freezing Brentwater wind battered my windshield as I drove my rusted pickup truck into the subterranean parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. I bypassed the visitor section entirely and parked in a highly secured space that had been permanently reserved under my name for over 2 decades. The armed security guard standing by the private executive elevator did not ask for my identification. He simply nodded respectfully and pressed his thumb against the biometric wall scanner. The heavy steel doors slid open smoothly, taking me up to the 52nd floor. I left the poor, pathetic old man persona down in the cold streets. By the time the elevator chimed, my posture had straightened, and my gaze had sharpened into stone. I was exactly who I needed to be. The doors parted to reveal a massive, dimly lit office overlooking the glittering city skyline. Frank stood waiting by a long mahogany conference table. He had been my lead corporate attorney for 30 solid years. Frank was a man whose absolute loyalty was matched only by his terrifying ruthlessness in a boardroom. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask how my dinner with my daughter and her new in-laws went. He already knew why I was there. He simply pushed a stack of thick, leather-bound corporate files across the polished table. I took off my faded tweed jacket, draped it over the back of a leather chair, and sat down. I placed my hands flat on the table, feeling the immense weight of my entire life resting beneath my palms. I stared at the gold-embossed logo, gleaming on the top file. Sterling Meridian Logistics. Wesley loved throwing that corporate name around, as if he had pulled the company from the ground with his own bare hands. He used his position as chief executive officer to intimidate waiters, impress his arrogant parents, and belittle me. He had absolutely no idea what it actually took to build an empire. I built this massive company from nothing but dirt and desperation. 30 years ago, my wife Rosalind passed away unexpectedly. I was left entirely alone in a dark world, with a grieving toddler and a crushing mountain of medical debt. I took my last few dollars and bought a single broken-down delivery truck at a local police auction. I worked 20 hours a day, hauling heavy freight through freezing sleet and blistering summer heat. I kept my little girl Adeline asleep in a makeshift bed in the passenger seat because I could not afford basic childcare. I skipped meals so she could eat. Every single dime I made went straight back into the business. I turned one struggling truck into a fleet of 10. I turned 10 trucks into 100. Eventually, I transformed a desperate hustle into an international logistics network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sterling Meridian Logistics was my blood, my sweat, and my relentless determination to give my daughter a completely safe world. 10 years ago, I realized my heart could no longer handle the grueling corporate pace. I had secured our financial future permanently. I decided to step away from the public eye. I wanted to live a quiet, unremarkable life, tend to my small suburban garden, and watch Adeline grow into a fiercely independent woman. I instructed Frank to draft the paperwork to place my 70% majority ownership of Sterling Meridian Logistics into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust. I appointed Frank as the primary executive and completely removed my personal name from the public corporate registry. To the outside business world, the founder had essentially vanished into a peaceful, anonymous retirement. The executive board was left to manage the daily operations, completely unaware of my mundane daily life. 2 years ago, that same board of directors hired a rising corporate star named Wesley to take over as chief executive officer. They hired him purely on the strength of his aggressive resume and his ability to wear sharp suits. Wesley stepped into the massive corner office, believing he had conquered the business world entirely on his own merit. When he married my daughter, he looked at my scuffed boots, my simple clothes, and my small suburban house. He immediately categorized me as an uneducated failure. He had absolutely no idea that the massive corporation funding his luxury cars, his tailored suits, and his arrogant pride belonged entirely to the quiet old man he was actively trying to erase from his life. He thought he was the undisputed king of the castle. He was merely a hired hand, working blindly inside a fortress I built with my own hands. I looked up at Frank. He stood silently across the table, waiting for my directive. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out the crisp white envelope containing the $20,000 bribe Wesley and his parents had offered me just an hour earlier. I tossed it onto the center of the table. I told Frank that my son-in-law had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. He had mistaken my chosen silence for weakness, and my simple lifestyle for utter defeat. He wanted to buy my absence to protect his precious corporate image. I told Frank it was time to show Wesley exactly who owned and controlled that image. I leaned forward and gave the absolute order. I instructed Frank to legally lift the veil of the blind trust immediately. I demanded my name be reinstated on the private executive registry. I wanted total, unrestricted access to the highest level of corporate clearance. Frank nodded, a sharp, cold smile forming on his face. He opened his secure laptop and typed a rapid sequence of commands that instantly deactivated the decade-long anonymity shield protecting my controlling shares. The system chimed softly, confirming that Theodore Marsh was officially back in absolute control of the board. The sleeping giant had been violently awakened by a fool who thought he was throwing stones at a ghost. The corporate wall, separating my personal life from my business empire, was completely shattered. But exposing my identity was only the first step. I was not just going to fire Wesley. I needed to know exactly what he was doing behind my desk. I ordered Frank to prepare the accounting team. We were going to open the books. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded tweed jacket and pulled out the crisp white envelope. I dropped it onto the polished mahogany table, right in front of Frank. The heavy thud of the paper seemed to echo in the quiet office. I told Frank to open it. He reached out, his practiced hands sliding the cashier's check from the unsealed flap. He looked at the $20,000 and then looked up at me with a silent question in his eyes. I told him that was the exact price my son-in-law placed on my dignity. That was the amount Wesley and his arrogant parents believed was sufficient to banish me to a low-tier retirement facility, completely erased from my daughter's life. They wanted me to take their money and disappear so I would not stain their pristine corporate image. Frank placed the check down. His expression hardened into a cold mask of professional fury. He knew the sacrifices I had made to build Sterling Meridian Logistics. He knew I had skipped meals and slept in a freezing delivery truck so Adeline could have a safe, warm bed. I leaned across the table and gave Frank his next directive. I told him I did not just want to fire Wesley. I wanted to dismantle his entire existence. I ordered a complete, ruthless forensic audit of every single executive account Wesley had touched since the board appointed him chief executive officer. The nature of the conflict instantly shifted. This was no longer a personal insult dealt over expensive steaks and cheap wine. This was outright corporate warfare. Frank did not waste a single second. Within an hour, he transformed the private boardroom into a secure command center. He brought in a team of elite forensic accountants, men and women who specialized in tearing down fraudulent financial empires piece by piece. They were the best in Brentwater, completely independent from the Sterling Meridian Logistics internal financial department. I sat at the head of the table, drinking bitter black coffee, watching them boot up their encrypted servers. I handed them Wesley's executive authorization codes, the very codes I had secretly granted him through the blind trust. I told the team to look for every hidden transaction, every unapproved bonus, and every shadowed expense report. I wanted them to crack open the foundation of Wesley's luxurious lifestyle and show me the rot festering underneath. The accountants worked in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the rapid, relentless clicking of keyboards. I watched the digital files populate on the massive wall monitor. Years of corporate data began to flow like a river of numbers. For 48 hours, I barely left that leather chair. I watched the team dissect the company I had built with my bare hands. I remembered the early days of Sterling Meridian Logistics. I remembered manually balancing the ledgers at my kitchen table, making sure every single driver was paid fairly, ensuring every vendor received their checks on time. I built my reputation on an unshakable foundation of absolute honesty. My word was a binding contract. I never took a single cent that did not belong to me. Seeing Wesley's name plastered across the top of the executive accounts filled me with a sickening sense of violation. He was sitting in my chair, using my company to fuel his vanity. As the second night approached, the lead accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Marguerite, stopped typing. She looked at Frank, and then turned her monitor toward me. She told me they had found a discrepancy. It was not a simple accounting error or a misplaced corporate expense. It was a massive, deliberate bleed. Marguerite pulled up a complex web of financial transfers on the main screen. She explained that for the past 18 months, Wesley had been systematically bypassing the board of directors' oversight committee. He was an arrogant snob, yes, but the audit revealed something far more dangerous. Wesley was a highly calculated criminal. He had created a network of dummy shell companies, registered under fake vendor names. He was signing off on massive logistical contracts for services that were never rendered. Millions of dollars of Sterling Meridian Logistics capital were being funneled directly out of the corporate treasury and disappearing into these phantom accounts. I stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. He was actively bleeding my life's work dry to fund his own personal kingdom. The man who had looked at me with absolute disgust, the man who had called me a pathetic burden, was nothing more than a parasitic thief feeding off my legacy. Every single transaction painted a picture of unbridled greed. The accountants traced the shell companies to private offshore accounts, controlled exclusively by Wesley. He had bypassed every security measure I had put in place when I stepped down a decade ago. He used his position to forge approval signatures from unaware department heads. He manipulated the quarterly profit reports to hide the massive holes in the company treasury. The board of directors had trusted him implicitly because he produced brilliant, fabricated presentations. He sold them a narrative of relentless corporate growth, while he was quietly butchering the company from the inside out. My chest tightened with a cold, unforgiving rage. He was stealing the future I had secured for Adeline. He was stealing the livelihoods of the thousands of honest employees who depended on Sterling Meridian Logistics to feed their own families. I looked at Frank. The evidence was irrefutable. We had the digital footprints, the forged invoices, and the offshore routing numbers. Wesley was committing severe federal fraud. The penalty for this level of corporate embezzlement was decades in a maximum security federal prison. Frank asked me if I wanted him to contact the authorities immediately. He said we could have Wesley arrested at his desk by morning. I shook my head slowly. An immediate arrest was too quiet. It was too clean. Wesley and his arrogant parents had humiliated me in public. They had tried to buy my dignity and erase me from my daughter's life with a $20,000 check. They believed they were untouchable masters of the universe. I refused to let them hide behind a quiet corporate scandal. I wanted Wesley to feel the exact same public humiliation he had tried to force upon me. I told Frank to prepare a comprehensive dossier of every single stolen dime. I told him to lock down the evidence and prepare for a total corporate execution. But the threat was escalating rapidly. Marguerite interrupted my thoughts. She pulled up an internal corporate memo Wesley had just sent to the board of directors. Wesley was planning something massive, an aggressive move that would allow him to steal the rest of the company right out from under the blind trust. The war had just accelerated, and we were running out of time. Marguerite's fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the complex digital roots of the stolen millions. The offshore accounts we had discovered were not the final destination. They were merely a transit hub, a smokescreen designed to hide the true movement of the capital. She brought up a new set of encrypted banking records and displayed them on the main conference room monitor. I stood up from my leather chair and walked closer to the glowing screen. The conflict instantly shifted from a sterile corporate theft to a deeply personal violation. Wesley was not hiding the money in the Sable Isles for some future escape. He was actively funneling it back into the United States through a tangled web of supposed consulting fees, fake marketing retainers, and anonymous family trusts. The primary beneficiaries of these fraudulent trusts were Bertram and Priscilla. I stared at the financial statements illuminating the dark room. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening, undeniable clarity. The opulent lifestyle Bertram had rubbed in my face just hours ago was not the result of brilliant investments or a lifetime of hard work. Their entire high society existence was a carefully constructed mirage, funded entirely by capital stolen directly from my company treasury. Marguerite pulled up the specific expenditure reports linked to the family trust. I saw the itemized receipts for the 3-week vacation on the Ligurian coast that Bertram had loudly bragged about over his expensive steak. I saw the massive invoices for the custom charcoal suits, the designer luggage, and the diamond jewelry Priscilla wore like a royal crown. I saw the transfer logs for 2 imported luxury vehicles, registered directly in Bertram's name, paid for in full, using cash diverted from a Sterling Meridian Logistics shipping contract. Then Marguerite opened the largest transaction file of the entire forensic audit. Just 2 weeks ago, Wesley had wired $4 million from a Sterling Meridian Logistics Emergency Reserve Fund directly into Priscilla's private holding company. The money was immediately used to purchase a newly commissioned 80-foot yacht docked securely at a premier marina in Port Selvara. My breathing slowed as the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the crime washed over me. I thought back to the crisp white envelope sliding across the mahogany table at the restaurant. They had looked me right in the eye and offered me a $20,000 bribe to pack up my life and disappear from my daughter's world. They had told me I was a social anchor, dragging down their pristine image. The crushing irony was that the very money they used to insult my dignity had been stolen from the treasury I built with my own bare hands. They had tried to buy my absolute absence, using my own life savings. A hot, violent wave of pure rage threatened to break my carefully maintained composure. I remembered the grueling early years of building Sterling Meridian Logistics. I remembered sitting with my first dozen drivers in a freezing warehouse, promising them fair wages and building a secure pension fund from our very first profits, so their families would never know the crippling hunger I had known. I treated the corporate treasury with absolute reverence because it represented the survival and security of thousands of honest, hard-working people. Wesley was using that sacred treasury as a personal piggy bank to buy yachts for 2 arrogant parasites who had never worked a hard day in their miserable lives. I closed my eyes, forcing the hot anger back down deep into my chest. Anger makes a man careless, and I could not afford a single tactical mistake. I let the rage cool and solidify into a heavy, unbreakable block of calculated ice. I did not just want to fire my son-in-law anymore. Firing him would be a profound mercy. Sending him quietly to prison would allow his parents to hide the stolen assets, declare bankruptcy, and continue playing the victims of a rogue son. I wanted to completely dismantle their entire reality. I wanted Bertram and Priscilla to feel the exact level of poverty, helplessness, and public humiliation they had tried to force upon me. I turned back to Frank. The brilliant attorney stood silently, reading the cold determination settling over my features. I told him we were no longer just preparing a standard executive termination package. We were going to invoke federal racketeering laws. I ordered Frank to trace every single physical asset, Bertram and Priscilla had purchased over the past 18 months. I wanted every car, every piece of jewelry, every vacation home, and the massive yacht legally tethered to the criminal embezzlement case. When the federal authorities finally moved in, I wanted the net to fall over the entire family simultaneously. Bertram and Priscilla were not innocent bystanders, completely ignorant of their son's sudden wealth. The financial trails proved they were active accomplices, knowingly receiving stolen corporate capital through fraudulent consulting firms registered in their own names. Frank nodded sharply, a predatory gleam in his eye. He immediately began pulling out the necessary legal mandates to freeze civilian assets linked to corporate fraud. I told him to prepare the legal guillotine with absolute precision. We were not going to strike tonight. We were going to let Wesley proceed with his grand corporate merger gala this weekend. We were going to let him stand on a brightly lit stage in front of the city's elite, believing he had successfully pushed the pathetic old father-in-law out of the picture. We were going to let Bertram and Priscilla wear their stolen diamonds, drink their expensive champagne, and bask in the admiration of their fake high society friends. I wanted them to reach the absolute pinnacle of their false arrogance. The higher they climbed up that pedestal of lies, the more devastating the fall would inevitably be. Marguerite handed me a printed summary of the stolen funds and the linked family accounts. I folded the heavy paper and placed it in the inner pocket of my shirt, right next to the $20,000 cashier's check Bertram had given me. The two pieces of paper rested against my chest, representing the complete timeline of their impending destruction. I thanked the accounting team for their relentless, brilliant work. I told them to lock the files, completely encrypt the servers, and speak to absolutely no one until I gave the signal. I grabbed my faded tweed jacket from the back of the leather chair and walked toward the private executive elevator. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Brentwater skyline, casting a cold, hard light across the sleeping city. Wesley truly thought he had outsmarted a foolish, uneducated old man. He believed his power was absolute. He was about to find out exactly what happens when you attempt to rob the architect of the fortress you are standing inside. I stepped into the elevator, my mind already calculating the exact sequence of events for the gala. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the execution was inevitable. The heavy thud of a luxury car door slamming shut echoed through my quiet suburban street. I was kneeling in the front yard, packing fresh soil around a row of newly planted hydrangeas. My hands were covered in dark earth, a physical reminder of the hard work that had always grounded my life. I heard the sharp, impatient click of expensive leather shoes marching up my concrete driveway. I did not need to look up to know who had arrived unannounced. Wesley cast a long, imposing shadow over my garden. He stood there in a tailored silver suit, looking at my modest single-story home as if it were an infectious disease. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask how my day was going. He merely demanded that we go inside immediately because the neighborhood aesthetic was ruining his mood. I stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from my hands onto an old rag, and led him into the house I had bought 30 years ago to raise his wife. Wesley stepped into my living room with a look of profound disgust, deliberately refusing to wipe his expensive shoes on the welcome mat. His eyes scanned the faded floral sofa, the worn brick fireplace, and the framed photographs of Adeline's childhood sitting on the mantel. He scoffed openly, clearly viewing my entire existence as a pathetic failure. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto my small wooden coffee table, snapping the gold clasps open with aggressive force. He pulled out a stack of crisp, densely typed legal documents and threw them down in front of me. He commanded me to sit down and read. I remained standing. I looked at the papers, then looked at the man who believed his fabricated corporate title gave him the right to act like a king in my home. Wesley stated that the $20,000 check his father had offered me at the restaurant was just the beginning of our arrangement. He had decided to formalize my complete removal from his life. He pointed a manicured finger at the printed pages, tapping the heavy cardstock to emphasize his authority. He explained that the document was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, combined with a total renunciation of rights. I was to legally swear that I would never speak of the financial bribe his parents had offered, and I would officially renounce any future claims to Adeline's financial support. He wanted me to legally bind myself to absolute poverty and permanent silence. I asked him what would happen if I refused to sign his insulting paperwork. Wesley stepped closer, invading my personal space, his voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper. He threatened to completely sever my relationship with my daughter. He claimed he controlled their joint finances, their living arrangements, and her entire future. He promised to make my life a living hell, ensuring I would never see Adeline or any future grandchildren if I dared to defy him. He spoke of my daughter, not as a woman he loved, but as a piece of property he had acquired. He was using my own flesh and blood as a bargaining chip to secure his fragile vanity. He was holding my family hostage to protect his fraudulent corporate image. I looked down at the legal contract resting on my coffee table. I read the clauses detailing my supposed financial irrelevance and my forced isolation. A younger version of me, the man who built a massive freight empire with blistered hands and raw fury, might have broken Wesley's jaw right there in the living room. I had crushed ruthless corporate rivals for far less disrespect, but I had spent decades learning the lethal power of absolute patience. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him a single ounce of anger or sorrow. I walked into the kitchen, washed the gardening soil from my hands, and dried them methodically. I returned to the living room, picked up a cheap plastic pen from the counter, and leaned over the coffee table. I signed my name at the very bottom of his extortion document. I signed it with a slow, deliberate, and chillingly calm smile. Wesley snatched the papers off the table the absolute second my pen lifted from the page. He shoved them back into his briefcase, his chest puffing out with overwhelming pride. He had come into my home and bullied an old man into submission. He felt like an untouchable master of the universe. His arrogance completely blinded him to the reality of what had just happened. He had just handed me written, signed proof of his attempt to extort the majority shareholder of his own company. He had documented his own blackmail. Wesley zipped his briefcase shut and walked toward the front door, his posture radiating unearned victory. Before stepping back out into the sunlight, he turned around to deliver his final calculated insult. He announced that he was hosting a massive corporate merger gala for Sterling Meridian Logistics this coming weekend. He described the event as the absolute pinnacle of his career, a night of extreme luxury that would cement his legacy as the most powerful chief executive in the city. He explicitly forbade me from going anywhere near the venue. He told me that my presence would be a grotesque embarrassment to his sophisticated guests. He warned me that the hotel security team would throw me out onto the street if I dared to show my face and humiliate him in front of the board of directors. I stood in the center of my quiet, modest living room. I looked at the man who had stolen millions from my company treasury to fund his parents' yacht, the man who was currently emotionally terrorizing my only child. I kept my voice perfectly even, devoid of any hostility or fear. I told Wesley that I understood his position completely. I wished him a highly successful evening at his grand celebration. Wesley sneered, muttered a final insult under his breath, and marched out the door. I watched through the front window as his luxury car sped away down my quiet street. He believed he had permanently removed me from the board. He had no idea that I was already rewriting the rules of the entire game. The paperwork was signed, the trap was fully set, and the weekend was fast approaching. The man who thought he had buried me was about to discover that he had dug his own grave. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the heavy rain began to fall against the roof of my small suburban home. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the extortion contract Wesley had forced me to sign just hours earlier. I was calculating the exact sequence of legal maneuvers Frank would execute on Monday morning. The silence of the house was absolute. Then a rapid, frantic knocking rattled my front door. It was not the confident, arrogant pounding of my son-in-law. It was a desperate, panicked rhythm. I walked down the hallway and pulled the door open. My daughter Adeline stood on the porch, shivering in the freezing downpour. She wore a thin coat over her clothes, completely soaked, her hair plastered to her cheeks. The bright, fiercely independent woman I had raised looked entirely shattered. She did not say a word. She simply collapsed into my chest, burying her face in my shoulder as a heavy sob tore through her throat. I pulled her inside immediately, locking the door against the cold night. I guided her into the kitchen, wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders, and made her a cup of hot tea. I did not ask her what was wrong. I knew exactly who had caused this. I pulled up a chair across from her and waited for her to catch her breath. Adeline wrapped her trembling hands around the warm ceramic mug. She looked down at the scratched surface of my old kitchen table. She told me she had gone to the grocery store that afternoon. When she tried to pay for a simple basket of food, her card was declined. She tried a second card, and then a third. Every single account with her name on it had been completely frozen. When she called Wesley to ask if there had been a bank error, he did not express concern. He exploded in a fit of rage. He accused her of being financially irresponsible. He told her she was a reckless liability to his corporate image, and that he had frozen the accounts to teach her a lesson in basic discipline. My hands curled into tight fists under the table. Wesley was systematically isolating her. He was cutting off her access to money, to strip away her independence, and force her into absolute submission. But financial isolation was only the first phase of his strategy. Adeline took a trembling breath and revealed the true reason she had fled into the storm. She told me Wesley had come home from work an hour later, carrying a stack of legal documents. He had thrown them onto their kitchen island and demanded she sign them immediately. The documents were a total transfer of assets. Wesley wanted her to sign over the private inheritance fund her mother had left for her. Before I built my logistics empire, before the blind trusts and the offshore accounts, my late wife Rosalind had received a small life insurance payout from her own parents. Rosalind had explicitly set that money aside for Adeline. It was a modest, untouchable safety net, designed to protect our daughter if the world ever turned against her. Wesley knew about that money. He told Adeline he needed the inheritance capital to secure a bridge loan for a massive new estate they were supposedly buying in Ashgrove Point. He claimed it was a temporary transfer, a mere formality required by the bank to process the mortgage. When Adeline hesitated, asking to read the paperwork first, Wesley became terrifyingly cruel. He called her an ungrateful burden. He accused her of not trusting his brilliance as a chief executive. He told her that if she did not sign the inheritance over to him by tomorrow morning, their marriage was effectively over. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my heartbroken daughter as the final, horrifying piece of Wesley's grand strategy locked perfectly into place. Wesley was not buying a house in Ashgrove Point. He was executing a total extraction protocol. Frank's forensic audit had already proven that Wesley was bleeding my company dry to fund his parents' fraudulent lifestyle and his own secret offshore accounts. Now the timeline became crystal clear. Wesley knew the upcoming corporate merger gala would create a massive influx of temporary capital. He planned to use the chaos of the merger to siphon the last remaining millions from the Sterling Meridian Logistics treasury. Once the merger was complete, and the corporate funds were secured in his untraceable shell companies, he was going to vanish. He was going to take the company millions, take the yacht he bought for Bertram and Priscilla, and completely abandon his life in Brentwater. But his greed was so absolute, so entirely consuming, that he could not leave a single dime behind. He wanted Rosalind's money too. He intended to strip my daughter of her last remaining safety net, drain her late mother's inheritance into his offshore accounts, and then file for divorce the moment his plane landed in a country without an extradition treaty. He was going to discard Adeline like garbage, leaving her penniless, humiliated, and utterly broken. A cold, lethal calm settled over my entire body. I looked at the tears streaming down my daughter's face. My instinct as a father was to tell her everything, right there in the kitchen. I wanted to tell her that I owned the building Wesley worked in. I wanted to tell her that I held his entire pathetic existence in the palm of my hand. I wanted to assure her that she was heir to an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that Wesley was nothing but a dead man walking. But I held my tongue. Adeline did not need a corporate titan in that moment. She needed her father. She needed the quiet, steady man who had always made her feel safe. More importantly, I needed Wesley to feel completely and totally invincible for just 48 more hours. If I revealed my identity to Adeline now, her shift in demeanor might alert Wesley that the trap had been sprung. I needed him to walk onto that brightly lit stage at the corporate gala, believing he was the undisputed king of the world. I reached across the table and took Adeline's trembling hands in mine. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. I told her, in a voice that left absolutely no room for doubt or debate, that she was not going back to that house. I told her she would sleep in her old childhood bedroom tonight, and she would not answer a single phone call or text message from her husband. I instructed her to ignore the bank accounts and absolutely refuse to sign over her mother's inheritance. Adeline looked up at me, her voice shaking, as she asked what we were going to do. She was terrified of Wesley's power, terrified of the massive corporate shadow he cast over their lives. She believed he held all the cards. I wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a man who had already won the war. I promised her that by the end of this weekend, Wesley would never be able to hurt her or anyone else ever again. I promised her that the nightmare was already over. She leaned back into her chair, closing her eyes as a long, heavy breath escaped her lungs. She trusted me completely. She did not ask how a retired laborer was going to defeat a powerful chief executive. She just knew her father had made a promise. I stood up, cleared the teacups from the table, and walked her to her old room. I waited until I heard the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing as she finally fell asleep. I walked back into the kitchen and picked up my cell phone. The pain I had just witnessed in my daughter's eyes erased any lingering trace of mercy I might have held for Wesley or his arrogant parents. This was no longer just a corporate cleanup. This was a profound, absolute reckoning. I dialed Frank's secure line and told him to escalate the timeline. The trap was going to snap shut at the gala, and it was going to be the most spectacular execution the city had ever seen. I left my daughter sleeping safely in her childhood bed and drove into the heart of the financial district before the sun even crested the Brentwater skyline. The city was still wrapped in a cold pre-dawn gray. I walked into Frank's office. He was already waiting for me, perfectly groomed, with a fresh pot of coffee steaming on his glass desk. There was no need for pleasantries. We both knew the timeline had accelerated. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite him and told him it was time to drop the hammer. I instructed Frank to legally execute the absolute power of my majority shares. I ordered an immediate and total executive freeze across the entire corporate structure of Sterling Meridian Logistics. By invoking my emergency shareholder privileges, I held the unilateral authority to lock the company's financial arteries. Frank drafted the mandate with ruthless efficiency. The document suspended all board-level transactional power. It froze every executive account. It halted any outbound corporate wire transfers and completely paralyzed the Treasury. I took a heavy black pen and signed my name at the bottom of the page. With that single signature, Wesley was entirely cut off from the company vault. He just did not know it yet. The reaction within the Sterling Meridian Logistics executive suite was instantaneous and beautifully chaotic. Frank monitored the internal corporate communications from his encrypted terminal. By 9 in the morning, the board of directors was in a state of absolute panic. For a decade, they had operated under the comfortable illusion that the anonymous founder was a silent, hands-off entity, content with simply collecting annual dividends. Now the ghost had suddenly awakened, slammed his fist on the table, and locked the vault. Emails flew back and forth across the secure servers in a frantic frenzy. Vice presidents were terrified. They had no idea why the founder had initiated a hard freeze. They scrambled to audit their own departments, terrified that they were the target of this sudden corporate wrath. I did not let them breathe. I ordered Frank to issue a second, far more terrifying directive to the board. As the controlling shareholder, I formally demanded a mandatory disclosure meeting, but I did not schedule it for a mundane Tuesday morning in a sterile conference room. I scheduled it for Saturday night, right in the middle of the grand corporate merger gala Wesley had so meticulously planned to celebrate his own fake brilliance. I ordered the legal department to mandate the attendance of the entire executive board, including the chief executive officer. Wesley would be forced to host the very meeting that would destroy him. Frank drafted the corporate summons with immaculate precision. He ensured my personal identity remained strictly classified, under the ironclad protections of the blind trust. To Wesley and the board, the summons simply came from the founder. The directive stated that the majority shareholder would emerge from anonymity to personally address the executive team regarding the future of the company. It was an offer the board could not possibly refuse, and a command Wesley could not legally ignore. He was legally bound to provide the stage for his own execution. But the corporate maneuvers were only half the battle. Firing Wesley was a simple business decision. Sending him to a federal penitentiary was a moral obligation. I watched Frank pick up his secure landline and bypass local law enforcement entirely. He contacted the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. Frank had spent the last 48 hours packaging the forensic audit into a bulletproof federal dossier. He spoke quietly into the receiver, laying out the absolute devastation of Wesley's crimes. Frank detailed the dummy shell companies. He listed the forged vendor invoices. He provided the exact routing numbers, showing millions of dollars systematically siphoned to purchase luxury yachts and European vacations for Bertram and Priscilla. The federal agents did not need convincing. The paper trail we provided was absolute and undeniable. It painted a clear picture of a greedy executive treating a multinational corporation like his own personal piggy bank. Frank coordinated the exact timing of the raid. The federal authorities agreed to have a tactical white-collar crime unit waiting silently in the service corridors of the hotel during the gala. They would remain completely out of sight until the trap was sprung. They would move in the absolute second I laid the evidence bare on the stage. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of Frank's office, looking down at the bustling financial district. Below me, thousands of people were rushing to their corporate jobs, entirely unaware of the invisible earthquake vibrating through the bedrock of Sterling Meridian Logistics. Wesley was currently sitting in his massive corner office, probably admiring his reflection in the glass, completely oblivious to the fact that his corporate credit cards were now worthless plastic. He thought he was a genius, orchestrating the perfect crime. He thought he could steal from my company, break my daughter's heart, and throw $20,000 in my face to secure his flawless victory. He believed he was untouchable because he wore a designer suit and held a fabricated title. He had no idea that true power does not reside in a title or a tailored jacket. True power is the ability to dismantle a man's entire universe without raising your voice. The legal trap was locked, loaded, and perfectly primed. Every escape route had been systematically eliminated. The federal agents were briefed. The board was terrified, and the stolen money was frozen. All I had to do now was wait for Saturday night. The smell of cedar sawdust and motor oil always brought me a profound sense of peace. It was late Wednesday afternoon, and I was standing in the middle of aisle 4 at Hadley & Sons Hardware. I wore my faded denim work jeans, scuffed leather boots, and a heavy flannel shirt that had seen better decades. I was loading 50-pound bags of organic potting soil onto a heavy metal flatbed cart. My hands were calloused and stained with dark earth. I have always believed that a man needs to keep his hands in the dirt to remember exactly where he came from. Building Sterling Meridian Logistics into a multinational powerhouse had required me to wear custom-tailored suits and sit in sterile glass boardrooms for years. But I never forgot the raw, honest labor that laid the absolute foundation of my life. I hauled the 6th heavy bag onto the cart, feeling the familiar, satisfying ache in my shoulders. I pushed the squeaking cart toward the front registers, enjoying the quiet rhythm of a simple afternoon. The local hardware store was my sanctuary. It was a place where people valued hard work over empty words and flashy titles. I was standing at the checkout counter, pulling my worn leather wallet from my pocket, when a shrill, completely out-of-place voice shattered the quiet atmosphere of the store. I turned my head slowly. Bertram and Priscilla were standing just inside the automatic sliding doors. They looked absolutely ridiculous in this environment. Bertram wore a pristine, cream-colored cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders, paired with spotless white loafers that had clearly never touched a single speck of real dirt. Priscilla was wrapped in a tailored silk trench coat, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than the cashier standing in front of me made in 6 months. They were entirely out of their element. They were likely lost, looking for an upscale garden boutique in the neighboring affluent suburb, and had wandered in here by mistake. Bertram spotted me almost instantly. His eyes swept over my dirty work boots, my faded flannel shirt, and the heavy bags of soil stacked on my metal cart. A cruel, predatory smile stretched across his face. He nudged his wife and pointed a manicured finger directly at me. Bertram strutted over to my checkout lane, pulling Priscilla along by her expensive silk sleeve. He did not bother to lower his voice or respect the quiet nature of the store. He wanted the cashier, an older gentleman named Alistair, who I had known for 15 years, to hear every single word. Bertram looked at the heavy bags of dirt and let out a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed off the high warehouse ceiling. He told me it was incredibly fitting to see me dressed like a vagrant, hauling fertilizer. He said it was exactly the kind of pathetic, low-level existence I was destined for, now that his brilliant son was permanently running my company. I stood completely still. I did not clench my fists. I did not raise my voice or offer an angry rebuttal. I simply looked directly into Bertram's arrogant eyes. I thought about the massive 80-foot yacht docked in Port Salvara that he was currently enjoying, a yacht purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds. He was a parasite, mocking the very host that was feeding him. Priscilla stepped forward, her heavy, expensive perfume creating a nauseating cloud that completely overpowered the honest smell of the hardware store. She looked at me with an expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust. She loudly announced that it was a true blessing I was finally accepting my proper place in the world. She bragged that Wesley was going to completely redefine Sterling Meridian logistics this weekend and erase every trace of my outdated blue-collar influence. She practically vibrated with malicious joy as she described the upcoming corporate merger gala. She told the entire front of the store that her son was about to become the most powerful chief executive in the state. She bragged about the imported champagne they were going to drink, the celebrity guest list they had curated, and the brilliant, luxurious future her family was stepping into. She looked down at my scuffed work boots and reminded me that people of my low class belong exactly where I was standing, covered in dirt and completely forgotten by high society. She told me to enjoy playing in the mud while the real masters of the universe built a lasting legacy. Bertram chuckled smoothly, adjusting his cashmere sweater, adding that they would be sure to toast to my miserable retirement while they were sailing on their new boat. I listened to every single insult without breaking eye contact for even a fraction of a second. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not defend my legacy or justify my clothing. I just let them talk. I let them dig their own graves with their own arrogant, careless words. They thought they were humiliating a defeated old man in public. They had absolutely no idea that they were speaking to the architect of their impending destruction. Every cruel word that fell from Priscilla's lips only reminded me of the tears streaming down my daughter Adeline's face the night before. Adeline had stood shivering in my kitchen, her credit cards frozen, and her inheritance threatened by the very family now mocking me. That memory fueled a cold, lethal calm deep inside my chest. Their arrogance was blinding them to reality. The federal agents were already briefed. The corporate trap was fully set, and the legal documents were signed. Every insult they hurled at me in this hardware store only sealed their absolute doom. I turned my attention back to Alistair, the cashier, who was looking at Bertram and Priscilla with silent, professional disdain. I handed him 3 crisp $100 bills to cover the cost of the organic soil. I told him in a warm, steady voice to keep the remaining change and buy his wonderful grandchildren something nice for the weekend. Alistair nodded respectfully, totally ignoring the 2 loud, obnoxious clowns standing behind me. He handed me my receipt and wished me a good day. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of my flatbed cart and pushed it right past Bertram and Priscilla. I did not say a single word to them. I did not give them a parting glance. I just walked steadily out the sliding glass doors and into the bright afternoon sun. I loaded the heavy bags of soil into the back of my old, reliable truck, feeling the weight of the earth in my hands. The storm was coming on Saturday night, and I was entirely prepared to watch it wash them all away. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its heavy brass pendulum swinging with a relentless mechanical rhythm. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, surrounded by the absolute silence of a sleeping suburban neighborhood. The stark white glow of a single overhead lamp illuminated the dense stacks of legal documents spread out before me. Tomorrow night was the grand corporate merger gala. Tomorrow night, Wesley believed he would cement his legacy as an untouchable corporate titan. I slowly turned the page of the forensic audit, tracing the columns of stolen millions with the tip of my pen. There was a profound, almost terrifying stillness in my chest. The anger that had burned so violently over the past week had entirely burned itself out. What remained was cold, sharp, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had already measured the exact dimensions of his enemy's grave. My cell phone buzzed against the wooden table, a harsh vibration breaking the quiet. It was Frank. I answered on the first ring, keeping my voice low and steady so as not to wake Adeline. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me the federal snare was officially armed. The lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had personally reviewed the final dossier we submitted. The evidence of forged invoices, offshore routing numbers, and dummy shell companies was absolutely irrefutable. Frank confirmed that a tactical unit of federal agents would be arriving at the hotel tomorrow evening in unmarked vehicles. They would position themselves in the service corridors, the underground parking garage, and the private security rooms long before the first guest even arrived. They would stand by in total silence, completely invisible to the arrogant socialites drinking champagne in the ballroom. The authorities were simply waiting for my signal. Once I laid the evidence bare on the stage and publicly exposed the fraud, the agents would move in and lock down the entire venue. No one would leave. The corporate guillotine was not just raised. It was oiled, sharpened, and waiting for the executioner to drop the blade. I thanked Frank for his flawless work and ended the call. I gathered the audit summaries, the bank transfer logs, and the photographic evidence of Bertram and Priscilla's luxury purchases. I squared the edges of the thick stack of papers and placed them inside a heavy, dark leather portfolio. I ran my hand over the smooth grain of the leather. This folder was not just a collection of corporate data. It was a lethal weapon, forged in the fires of their own unbridled greed. It contained the absolute proof of Wesley's parasitic theft and Bertram's eager, knowing complicity. It was the exact financial mechanism they had used to fund their opulent, fake high society lifestyle. And it was the very instrument that would now drag them down into public ruin. I snapped the brass clasp of the portfolio shut. The metallic click was as final as a prison cell door locking into place. There was absolutely no room left for mercy. Mercy was a privilege reserved for those who simply made mistakes. Wesley and his parents had not made a mistake. They had made a calculated, predatory choice to destroy my family for their own vanity. I left the portfolio on the table and walked down the quiet hallway to my bedroom. I opened the door to the deep cedar closet and reached all the way to the back. I pulled out a heavy protective garment bag that had not seen the light of day in exactly 10 years. I unzipped the canvas, carefully revealing a bespoke midnight blue suit tailored from the finest Italian wool. I had commissioned this suit for the evening I officially retired and handed the reins of Sterling Meridian Logistics over to the board of directors. It was the armor of the founder. For a decade, I had been content to wear faded denim and scuffed work boots, allowing the corporate world to forget the man who had built their empire from the dirt up. I had embraced the quiet life, genuinely believing my battles were over. But Wesley and Bertram had demanded a war. They had explicitly forced the architect of their fortress to return to the battlefield. I carried the suit to the ironing board, standing in the corner of the room. I plugged in the iron and waited for the heat to rise, watching the steam curl into the cool air. I laid the midnight blue trousers across the board and began to press the fabric with slow, meticulous precision. The rhythmic hiss of the steam and the smooth glide of the hot iron grounded me. It was a simple, repetitive task, but it felt deeply ceremonial. With every pass of the iron, I smoothed away the humble, invisible old man they had so openly mocked in the hardware store. I was pressing sharp, unforgiving creases into the fabric, preparing the uniform of a corporate executioner. I thought about Adeline sleeping in her childhood bed just down the hall, her heart broken by a man who viewed her as a temporary financial asset. I thought about the sheer arrogance of Wesley, storming into my living room, demanding I sign away my dignity and my daughter's inheritance. I thought about Bertram laughing at my dirty hands while wearing clothes bought with my stolen money. Every single memory fed the cold machinery of my resolve. They believed they were the masters of the universe, standing at the very top of a glittering mountain. They had absolutely no idea that the mountain they were standing on was a volcano, and I was holding the detonator. I hung the perfectly pressed suit on a heavy wooden valet stand by the window. The rich, dark fabric seemed to absorb the ambient light in the room, radiating a silent, heavy authority. Beside it, I placed a crisp white dress shirt and a silver silk tie. I polished a pair of black Oxford shoes until they gleamed like dark mirrors, erasing every speck of the gardening soil Bertram had found so incredibly amusing. The physical transformation was nearly complete. Tomorrow evening, the pathetic, low-class father-in-law they so deeply despised would vanish forever. In his place, the absolute majority shareholder of Sterling Meridian Logistics would walk through the gilded doors of their exclusive gala. I walked back into the kitchen and turned off the overhead lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The leather portfolio rested on the table, a dark silhouette against the polished wood. The collision course was irrevocably set. Physics and consequence were now in total control. Wesley had built his entire kingdom on a foundation of lies, theft, and profound disrespect. Tomorrow night, the gravity of his own actions would come crashing down upon his head. He wanted a grand spectacle to solidify his legacy in front of the city's elite. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. I was going to give him an audience. I stood in the quiet shadows of my home, staring out the window at the empty street. I did not feel a single trace of fear or hesitation. I was completely ready. The long game of patience and silence was officially over. Tomorrow the whole world would hear the sound of the falling blade. The grand ballroom of the City Hotel was a cathedral of glass and gold. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, fractured light over a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive orchids and imported champagne. A string quartet played a seamless classical melody from a raised platform in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for the illusion of total success. This was the pinnacle of high society, a carefully curated collection of politicians, bank executives, and industry leaders. To the untrained eye, it was a celebration of corporate triumph. To me, it was a crime scene. Every shimmering light, every velvet drape, and every silver platter of caviar had been paid for by the lifeblood of Sterling Meridian Logistics. Just an hour prior, I had stood in the quiet sanctuary of my modest living room, reviewing the final legal documents one last time. Frank had called on a secure line to confirm the trap was fully primed. The Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had meticulously reviewed the audit dossier we provided. They had traced every forged invoice and every offshore shell company directly back to Wesley. Frank assured me that federal agents were currently on standby, positioned in the service corridors, and completely invisible to the wealthy guests inside. There was absolutely no room left for mercy. I had spent the last hour in my bedroom, meticulously ironing the bespoke midnight blue suit I had kept hidden in a cedar closet for 10 years. It was the armor of the founder, a garment I had commissioned for the night I originally retired. As I slipped the heavy wool jacket over my shoulders, the humble, invisible old man vanished. I picked up the dark leather folder, containing the absolute proof of Wesley's theft and Bertram's complicity. The collision course was irrevocably set. Now I stood in the shadowed alcove of the mezzanine balcony, completely out of sight, watching the floor with the cold precision of a predator observing its prey. Wesley was standing in the exact center of the room, holding a crystal flute of champagne, as if it were a royal scepter. He was surrounded by a tight circle of senior board members and wealthy investors. He threw his head back and laughed at a joke, his teeth gleaming under the lights. His tailored tuxedo fit him flawlessly, projecting an aura of untouchable power. He looked like a man who had conquered the world. He was playing the role of the visionary chief executive, utterly blind to the fact that his corporate credit cards had been frozen, and his executive authority had been stripped away by my hand over 24 hours ago. He was a ghost, haunting his own celebration, acting like an invincible king while standing on a trap door. A few yards away from Wesley, Bertram and Priscilla were putting on a sickening display of their own. They glided through the crowd of dignitaries like royalty, inspecting their subjects. Bertram was aggressively patting the shoulder of a prominent city alderman, leaning in close to whisper some fabricated tale of his financial prowess. He wore a diamond-studded watch on his wrist, a timepiece I knew for an absolute fact was purchased using funds diverted from our logistics payroll. Priscilla was even worse. She paraded a heavy diamond necklace that caught the light with every step she took, her silk gown trailing behind her. She was introducing herself to the wives of our largest shareholders, acting as if she were the matriarch of an established dynasty. They were flaunting their stolen wealth, intoxicated by the attention, drinking in the respect of people who would not even look their way if they knew the truth. They were completely insulated by their own arrogance. They did not notice the silent, broad-shouldered men standing near the service exits, wearing earpieces. They did not see the federal agents waiting in the shadows. I checked the gold pocket watch Rosalind had given me on our 20th anniversary. The time for observation was over. The mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting I had secretly forced the legal department to schedule was set to begin in exactly 3 minutes. I turned away from the balcony and walked down the sweeping carpeted staircase toward the main foyer. With every step I took, the weight of the past week fell away. The crisp, heavy wool of the midnight blue suit pulled perfectly across my shoulders, demanding respect and projecting absolute, uncompromising authority. The physical transformation was striking. I was no longer the pathetic, uneducated father-in-law they had mocked in the hardware store. I was the architect. I was the absolute majority shareholder of Sterling Meridian Logistics, and I was about to reclaim my throne. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the marble floor of the grand foyer. 2 massive, heavy mahogany doors separated me from the ballroom. I did not pause or hesitate. I did not wait for an invitation. I placed both hands firmly against the polished wood and pushed the heavy doors open with a forceful, echoing crack. The heavy thud of the mahogany doors, striking the walls, instantly cut through the ambient noise of the gala. The string quartet missed a beat, the high notes faltering as the musicians looked toward the entrance. A ripple of silence washed over the room, starting from the back and moving rapidly toward the center. Hundreds of heads turned to see who had dared to interrupt the meticulous flow of the evening. I stepped into the brilliant light of the ballroom. I did not walk with the slow, shuffling gait of a retired old man. I moved with long, deliberate strides, my posture completely straight, my eyes locked dead ahead. The midnight blue suit absorbed the light, making me look like a dark, immovable pillar against a sea of vibrant colors. The younger executives and the politicians merely looked confused, wondering who this imposing figure was. But the older board members, the men and women who had been with Sterling Meridian Logistics since the early days, recognized me instantly. I saw the blood drain from the face of our chief financial officer. I saw the lead legal counsel take a sudden, staggering step backward, dropping his champagne glass onto the thick carpet. The whispers began to spread like wildfire. The board members were utterly terrified. The ghost had returned. The wave of terrified silence finally reached the center of the room. Wesley stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned around, an irritated scowl forming on his face, clearly annoyed that his audience had looked away. His eyes found me walking steadily across the ballroom floor. For a fraction of a second, his brain completely failed to process what he was seeing. He saw the face of the man he had verbally abused in a small kitchen, but the posture, the clothing, and the terrifying aura of power did not match his reality. Bertram and Priscilla stopped their parade. Priscilla's hand flew to her stolen diamond necklace, her jaw dropping open in sheer disbelief. Bertram's arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing confusion. They had explicitly forbidden me from attending. They had threatened to have me thrown out on the street. Yet here I was, walking through the very center of their kingdom, radiating absolute authority, and not a single security guard dared to step in my path. I did not stop. I kept my eyes locked on Wesley, walking directly toward the main stage, carrying the heavy leather folder that held the end of his life. The music in the grand ballroom seemed to fade into a dull, vibrating hum as I walked across the polished marble floor. The vast crowd of politicians, bank executives, and corporate leaders parted before me instinctively, sensing a sudden, heavy shift in the atmosphere. They did not know who I was, but they recognized the absolute authority radiating from the midnight blue suit. Bertram and Priscilla were standing near a towering, glittering ice sculpture, holding crystal flutes of imported champagne. Priscilla spotted me first. I watched the color completely drain from her heavily powdered face. Her hand trembled so violently that she spilled a splash of golden liquid down the front of her expensive silk gown. She grabbed Bertram by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the fabric of his sleeve. Bertram turned his head, following her terrified gaze. His initial expression of mild, wealthy annoyance instantly twisted into a mask of furious, unadulterated rage. They immediately abandoned their conversation with a prominent local politician and marched directly toward me. They moved with the frantic, aggressive energy of people terrified that their carefully constructed illusion was about to be violently shattered. Bertram blocked my path, stepping so close that I could smell the sharp scent of alcohol on his breath. He looked me up and down, his eyes practically bulging with hatred. He did not register the immaculate tailoring or the quality of the bespoke Italian wool I was wearing. He only saw the man he had ruthlessly mocked in the hardware store, the man he deeply believed belonged in the dirt. He lowered his voice into a vicious hiss, demanding to know how a pathetic beggar had slipped past the heavy front doors. He accused me of sneaking through the service entrance like a rat, looking for scraps. Priscilla stepped up right beside him, her face flushed red with venom. She hissed that I was a disgusting embarrassment to her family and to high society. She told me I was deliberately trying to ruin the most important night of her son's life. She ordered me to turn around, walk out the door, and crawl back to my miserable suburban shack before she had me thrown out by force. I did not blink. I did not offer them a single word of response. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the dark leather folder at my side. I looked right through them, treating them with the exact level of absolute insignificance they truly possessed. The commotion had not gone completely unnoticed. Across the vast ballroom, Wesley stood frozen near the main stage. He was entirely surrounded by the executive board of directors, the exact men and women he desperately needed to impress to solidify his corporate takeover. I watched him notice the sudden disturbance. I watched his eyes lock onto my face. The sheer, blinding panic that washed over his features was a beautiful, magnificent sight. His arrogant, practiced smile completely collapsed. He quickly excused himself from the circle of senior executives, his neck flushing a deep, angry crimson. He marched across the ballroom floor, his polished leather shoes striking the marble with heavy, aggressive thuds. He was sweating heavily under the bright chandelier lights. The confident, untouchable king of Sterling Meridian Logistics was suddenly terrified of a single old man standing quietly in his ballroom. Wesley shoved his way past a group of startled investors and inserted himself directly between Bertram and me. He lowered his voice into a vicious, trembling growl. He asked me if I had completely lost my mind. He aggressively reminded me of the legal documents I had signed in my living room just 24 hours ago. He told me I had permanently surrendered every single right I had to his family and to his company. He demanded to know why I was deliberately trying to humiliate him in front of the wealthy elite who controlled his future. He threatened to completely destroy my relationship with Adeline. He promised to make absolutely sure I died completely alone, entirely cut off from my only daughter and any future grandchildren. He was practically vibrating with rage, projecting all of his guilt, fear, and profound arrogance directly onto me. He truly believed he still held the absolute power. He firmly believed he could simply bully me back into quiet submission. I let his threats hang in the cold, tense air between us. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or try to match his frantic, sweating energy. I simply stood there, a solid, immovable wall of midnight blue wool, holding the physical proof of his impending federal indictment. I looked at the heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I looked at the way his hands trembled as he pointed his finger at my chest. He was completely unraveling right in front of me. He could not comprehend why his ruthless threats were no longer working. He could not understand why the uneducated father-in-law was not cowering in absolute fear. My complete silence infuriated him more than any shouted insult could have. It drove him straight to the edge of reason. Wesley realized that verbal intimidation was failing. His eyes darted frantically around the crowded room, desperate to regain total control of his narrative. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers sharply in the air, signaling aggressively across the ballroom. He locked eyes with the head of corporate security, a massive, broad-shouldered man standing near the main entrance. Wesley pointed his finger directly at me. He ordered the security chief to physically remove me from the premises immediately. He did not care about keeping his voice down anymore. He wanted the surrounding guests to hear him assert his dominance. He loudly announced that I was a deranged trespasser who had harassed his family for months. He instructed the security team to drag me out into the street, throw me onto the pavement, and call the city police. He declared that he was pressing full criminal charges for trespassing and harassment. He wanted to make a brutal public spectacle of my physical removal. He wanted the entire board of directors to see him decisively eliminate a threat. Bertram and Priscilla smirked, crossing their arms in unified, malicious satisfaction. They were eager to watch me be deeply humiliated and violently dragged out of the luxury hotel. The head of security began to move. He was a veteran professional, a man I had personally approved for hire over a decade ago to protect the Sterling Meridian Logistics corporate headquarters. He marched across the floor, his face an unreadable mask of strict duty. Two other large guards flanked him, moving in tight formation to execute the extraction. The wealthy crowd parted completely, stepping back to avoid the impending physical altercation. Wesley sneered at me, whispering that my pathetic little rebellion was officially over. He told me I was about to spend the rest of the night rotting in a concrete holding cell. I kept my breathing slow and perfectly even. I did not take a single step backward. I kept both hands firmly planted on the dark leather folder. The head of security reached our group. He raised his heavy hand, preparing to grasp my shoulder and physically force me toward the exit. Wesley stepped back proudly, giving the guards room to do their violent work. But the heavy hand never touched my suit. Before the security chief could make contact, a tall, immaculate figure stepped smoothly out from the shadows of the nearby mezzanine pillar. It was Frank. My chief legal counsel moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who owned the entire battlefield. He did not shout. He did not run. He simply walked into the exact center of the confrontation and stood directly beside me. The head of security stopped dead in his tracks. His heavy hand froze completely in midair. The veteran guard recognized Frank instantly. Every senior employee in the Sterling Meridian Logistics Security Division knew that Frank was the sole earthly representative of the anonymous founder's blind trust. Frank was the absolute highest legal authority in the entire corporate structure, completely superseding the chief executive officer. The security chief looked at Frank, then looked at me, standing calmly by his side, wearing the bespoke suit and holding the heavy executive portfolio. The realization hit the security professional like a physical blow. He instantly understood the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. He recognized the true absolute chain of command. The massive man immediately lowered his hand. He took a deliberate step backward, squared his broad shoulders, and bowed his head respectfully toward me. He did not look at Wesley. He did not acknowledge Bertram or Priscilla. The absolute authority of the room had just violently shifted, and Wesley was left standing, completely exposed in the wreckage of his own shattered reality. Frank did not wait for the security chief to fully retreat. He turned his back on the trembling guards and walked purposefully toward the grand stage at the far end of the ballroom. His footsteps were completely silent on the thick carpet, but the crowd instinctively parted for him. People recognized the chief legal counsel of the Blind Trust. They knew his presence meant corporate business of the highest magnitude. The string quartet was still playing a soft classical piece in the corner of the room. They were completely oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred on the floor. Frank climbed the 3 short steps to the stage. He approached the sleek silver microphone standing in the center. He reached out and tapped the metal mesh twice with his index finger. The sharp, amplified sound echoed like a gunshot across the cavernous room. The musicians jumped in their seats. The cellist dragged his bow harshly across the strings, producing a discordant screech before the music abruptly died. The sudden silence was absolute and suffocating. Hundreds of conversations ceased in the exact same second. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft murmur of high society networking were instantly replaced by a thick, heavy anticipation. Every eye in the luxurious ballroom was fixed on Frank. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, politicians, and corporate executives. He did not smile. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone that carried the undeniable weight of federal law. He formally announced that he was calling an emergency mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting to order. A ripple of confusion washed over the crowd. Gala dinners were meant for clinking glasses and celebrating corporate mergers, not executing emergency corporate bylaws. A few board members began to exchange nervous glances. They understood the legal terminology Frank was using. They knew that a mandatory shareholder meeting could only be invoked under circumstances of severe financial peril or executive misconduct. Frank continued without a single pause. He stated that under the specific provisions of the corporate charter, the absolute majority shareholder possessed the unilateral right to freeze all executive actions and address the board of directors at any time. He announced that for the first time in a decade, the anonymous founder of Sterling Meridian Logistics had chosen to step out of the shadows. The founder had seen the internal rot spreading through his company and had arrived to personally correct the course. The founder was currently standing in this very room. Wesley let out a loud, theatrical scoff that carried clearly in the quiet room. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and puffed out his chest. He was completely oblivious to the reality closing in around him. He genuinely believed this was simply a dramatic corporate stunt. He thought it was a surprise introduction organized by the elusive billionaire to publicly bless the upcoming merger and validate his leadership. Wesley looked eagerly around the room. He scanned the crowd of older, wealthy men in custom tuxedos, searching for a face he could charm. He prepared his most winning, charismatic smile. He thought he was about to shake hands with a legendary business titan and welcome him to the stage as an equal. He assumed the founder would pat him on the back and praise his brilliant mind in front of the entire city. He was already planning the press release that would follow this momentous occasion. His vanity entirely blinded him to the cold truth standing just a few yards away. Frank did not scan the room. He kept his eyes perfectly level. He raised his right hand and pointed a single steady finger directly at me. The crowd collectively turned their heads, following the invisible line from the stage to where I stood in my midnight blue suit. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes hit me all at once. I did not rush. I tightened my grip on the heavy leather folder containing the forensic audit. I began to walk toward the stage. The crowd parted before me like water, giving me a wide berth. Every step I took was measured and deliberate. I was no longer the dirty man buying soil at the hardware store. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable father-in-law they could safely ignore and abuse. I was the architect of the very floor they were standing on. I walked past the terrified faces of the senior vice presidents, who recognized the shift in power. I walked past the silent federal agents, waiting near the exits, knowing they were simply waiting for me to speak the words that would authorize their arrest warrants. I reached the wooden steps leading up to the platform and began to climb. The solid thud of my polished shoes against the wood echoed in the silent room. I stepped onto the stage and took my place right next to Frank. I looked down at the crowd. Wesley was standing in the front row, less than 10 feet away. The arrogant smile had completely vanished from his face. The healthy flush of his skin evaporated in an instant, leaving him the color of dirty ash. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stared up at me, his eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated terror he could not conceal. His brain was violently rejecting the image in front of him. The man holding the absolute power over his entire existence was the same man he had mocked, stolen from, and tried to throw into the street just moments ago. He realized in that agonizing second that his career, his wealth, and his freedom were entirely in my hands. He looked at the thick leather folder I carried and understood that his perfect crime had been completely exposed. A few feet away from Wesley, Bertram and Priscilla were frozen in a state of absolute shock. Priscilla stood completely rigid. Her hand was still clutching her stolen diamond necklace, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked at my bespoke suit and the undeniable authority I commanded on the stage. The horrible realization that she had just spent 30 minutes publicly insulting the billionaire founder of the company crashed over her like a physical wave. Bertram looked like he was going to be violent. He swayed slightly on his expensive Italian loafers. The smug, predatory sneer he had worn all evening was replaced by the terrified stare of a trapped animal. They had spent years building a fake dynasty on the back of my quiet labor. They had believed I was weak simply because I was kind. They had mistaken my preference for a quiet, simple life as a lack of intelligence or capability. Now the absolute foundation of their stolen empire was dissolving under their feet. The millions of dollars they had siphoned, the luxury cars they drove, the exotic vacations they flaunted, were all about to be catalogued as federal evidence. The silence in the ballroom stretched out, tense and heavy, with impending devastation. I stood at the center of the stage, looking out over the empire I had built from nothing. I stepped up to the sleek microphone, opened the heavy leather folder, and prepared to dismantle their world completely. I stood at the polished acrylic podium and looked out over the sea of terrified faces. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the stage lights above me. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. True power does not require volume. It requires absolute, unshakable certainty. I leaned into the silver microphone, and my voice echoed through the cavernous space with terrifying corporate precision. I welcomed the board of directors, the shareholders, and the distinguished guests to this mandatory emergency disclosure meeting. I told them that for the past decade, I had entrusted the daily operations of Sterling Meridian Logistics to a new generation of leadership. I had believed in their vision and their integrity, but trust without verification is simply foolishness, and my recent verification had uncovered a staggering level of betrayal. I raised my right hand, and gave a sharp, brief nod to the audiovisual technicians stationed in the glass booth at the back of the room. Frank had secured their complete loyalty hours ago. The massive high-definition screens behind me had been displaying the sleek, glowing logo of the new corporate merger. In a fraction of a second, those screens went completely black. Then they lit up with something far more illuminating. Huge, blown-up images of offshore bank statements, corporate ledgers, and shell company registries flooded the screens. The harsh white light of the financial documents illuminated the shocked faces of the elite crowd. I began to speak methodically, walking the board of directors through every single step of the fraud. I detailed the fake vendors Wesley had created to funnel cash out of our hardware division. I showed the audience exactly how he had manipulated the quarterly earnings reports to hide the financial bleeding. I pointed to the specific wire transfer logs, highlighting the exact dates and the exact amounts that had been diverted into untraceable accounts. The audience stared at the screens in absolute horror. These were bankers, politicians, and seasoned investors. They knew exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at a textbook embezzlement scheme, orchestrated at the highest level of leadership. I did not let them look away. I narrated the flow of the stolen money, tracking it from the corporate treasury, through a labyrinth of dummy corporations, and finally into the personal private accounts of the man standing in the front row. I watched the senior vice presidents physically step away from Wesley, as if his corruption was a contagious disease. The murmurs of disbelief began to ripple through the room, growing louder with every new piece of evidence I presented. The elite crowd began to realize that the man they had been celebrating was nothing more than a highly skilled parasite. But I was not finished. The corporate theft was only one part of this execution. The personal arrogance of his family required a much more specific dismantling. I pressed a button on the podium, and the massive screens shifted again. A highly detailed official ownership deed for an 80-foot luxury yacht flashed onto the displays. The purchase price was circled in bright red ink. Right next to the deed was the corresponding wire transfer from a Sterling Meridian Logistics Phantom account, matching the exact dollar amount down to the very last cent. I looked directly at Bertram and Priscilla, who were standing frozen in the middle of the crowd. I spoke clearly and deliberately into the microphone. I announced to the entire ballroom that the brilliant lifestyle of the chief executive officer's family was nothing but a pathetic illusion, funded entirely by stolen corporate capital. I pointed out that the very clothes on their backs, the designer jewelry they were flaunting, and the champagne they were drinking were bought with money stolen from my company. Bertram turned the color of chalk. He shrank back into the crowd, desperately trying to hide from the blinding light of the screens. Priscilla let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Her diamond necklace suddenly looked like a heavy chain around her neck. The elite crowd around them parted instantly, leaving Bertram and Priscilla standing completely alone in a wide circle of pure social isolation. The high society guests who had been drinking their expensive champagne suddenly looked at their glasses as if the liquid had turned to poison. The politicians and socialites who had been praising them just 10 minutes ago now looked at them with unvarnished disgust. I exposed their fake wealth and their fabricated aristocracy to the very people they so desperately wanted to impress. They were not titans of industry. They were common thieves playing dress-up with my money. The collective gasp from the audience was a beautiful symphony of ruined reputations. Wesley could no longer handle the absolute destruction of his universe. His brain snapped under the crushing weight of public humiliation. He let out a desperate, ragged shout and lunged toward the wooden steps of the stage. He scrambled up the stairs, his perfectly tailored tuxedo pulling awkwardly around his sweating frame. His face was twisted in a mask of pure panic. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to physically rip the microphone away from me. He stammered wildly, shouting that the documents were forged and that this was a massive conspiracy to frame him. He begged the board of directors not to listen to a single word I was saying. He sounded like a terrified child caught in a terrible lie. He looked completely pathetic, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his carefully cultivated executive persona in front of everyone who mattered. Frank took a swift step forward, ready to physically intercept him, but I raised my hand and stopped my lawyer. I did not need protection from a broken man. I stood my ground, immovable and calm, as Wesley desperately clawed at the air between us. He was weeping now, tears of frustration and terror ruining his perfect image. He babbled that he could fix everything, that he could return the money, that he just needed one more chance to explain the complex financial structures. His breathless, frantic excuses echoed through the microphone, broadcasting his pathetic desperation to the entire room. He promised to step down quietly if I just turned off the screens and let him walk away. I looked him dead in the eye. All the noise in the room faded away, until there was only the space between us. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring my voice would carry to the very back of the hall and out into the city beyond. I told him that his explanations were worthless and his promises were empty. I told him that his tenure as a master of the universe was permanently over. With a voice as cold and hard as steel, I pronounced the final absolute sentence. I told Wesley that effective immediately, he was fired from Sterling Meridian Logistics. I stripped him of his title, his authority, and his access. I told him he was nothing but a petty thief in a borrowed suit, and he would never set foot in my building again. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The public execution was complete. Wesley collapsed to his knees, right there on the stage, sobbing into his hands as the reality of his total ruin finally crushed him. Wesley was a crumpled heap of tailored wool and shattered ego on the polished floorboards of the stage. The echoes of his termination still hung heavily in the dead silence of the grand ballroom. The elite crowd of politicians and corporate titans stood completely paralyzed. They were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I looked down at the man who had tried to steal my life and destroy my daughter. He was softly sobbing into his hands. His false bravado was entirely stripped away, but firing him was merely an administrative correction. It was a corporate formality. The true penalty for his profound betrayal had to extend far beyond the walls of Sterling Meridian Logistics. I slowly pulled my gaze away from Wesley and looked toward the back of the massive room. I raised my right hand into the air. It was a simple and silent gesture. It was the signal Frank and I had meticulously planned hours earlier. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently swung inward. They hit the walls with a massive thud that made several wealthy guests jump in pure fright. A team of 12 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division marched into the room. They wore dark tactical suits and heavy vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their presence completely shattered the fragile illusion of high society elegance. They moved with absolute military precision. Their heavy black boots hit the marble floors with a terrifying, rhythmic crunch. The wealthy guests instantly parted like water. Men in custom tuxedos and women in designer gowns practically climbed over each other to get out of the way. No one wanted to be standing anywhere near the blast radius of a federal raid. The lead agent walked directly toward the main stage. He did not look left or right. He climbed the wooden steps with heavy, purposeful strides. 2 other agents flanked him closely, covering his blind spots. Wesley lifted his tear-stained face just in time to see the federal authorities surrounding him. He tried to scramble backward like a cornered rat. He babbled incoherent pleas. He begged the agents to wait, and promised he could explain everything to a judge. The lead agent ignored his pathetic whimpering. He grabbed Wesley roughly by the shoulder of his expensive tuxedo jacket and hauled him to his feet. The agent violently twisted Wesley's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, snapping closed around Wesley's wrists, echoed sharply through the microphone I was still standing near. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had heard in 10 years. Wesley let out a high-pitched wail of despair as the cold steel bit into his skin. The untouchable corporate king was instantly reduced to a weeping federal prisoner. Down on the ballroom floor, the reality of the situation finally registered in Bertram's arrogant brain. He saw his son placed in handcuffs. He saw the federal raid fully unfolding. The cowardly instinct that defined his entire pathetic existence took over completely. He did not try to help his son. He did not even bother to check on his wife. Bertram simply turned on his pristine white loafers and bolted. He shoved a prominent city alderman out of his way and sprinted desperately toward the side exit doors near the catering kitchen. He looked absolutely ridiculous, running in his cashmere sweater. He thought he could simply slip away into the night and avoid the catastrophic consequences of his own greed. But Frank had prepared for every possible variable. 2 massive federal agents had been silently guarding that exact exit for over an hour. As Bertram threw his weight against the brass handle of the door, the agents stepped out of the shadows. They intercepted him with brutal efficiency. One agent grabbed Bertram by his cashmere sweater and slammed him firmly against the patterned wallpaper. Bertram shrieked in pain and terror as his hands were wrenched behind his back and secured in heavy iron cuffs. Priscilla stood completely frozen near the towering ice sculpture. She watched her husband being pinned to the wall and her son being held captive on the stage. Her heavily powdered face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. A female federal agent approached her with a stern, unyielding expression. The agent pulled a thick stack of legal warrants from her jacket. She loudly informed Bertram and Priscilla that they were officially under investigation for federal racketeering and receiving stolen corporate capital. She announced to the entire silent ballroom that every single one of their bank accounts had been entirely frozen. She stated that their luxury vehicles, their offshore accounts, and the massive 80-foot yacht docked in Port Selvara were immediately seized by the federal government. The agent looked directly at Priscilla and demanded the surrender of the diamond necklace she was currently wearing. She stated it was purchased with embezzled funds and was now classified as active federal evidence. Priscilla let out a guttural, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated universe burn to ash. Her knees buckled beneath her silk trench coat. She collapsed violently onto the polished floor, weeping hysterically. The female agent did not show a single ounce of pity. She leaned down and swiftly unclasped the heavy diamond necklace right off Priscilla's neck. She dropped the glittering jewels into a clear plastic evidence bag with a dismissive thud. Priscilla knelt on the floor, sobbing and gasping for air. She reached out with trembling hands toward the wealthy guests she had been trying to impress all evening. She begged them for help. She pleaded for someone to call a lawyer, but the elite crowd simply stared back at her with absolute, cold disgust. The society she so desperately craved was now looking at her like she was a diseased animal. The lead agent on the stage gave a sharp nod to his team. The authorities began to march Wesley, Bertram, and Priscilla toward the main entrance. It was a parade of absolute, total disgrace. Wesley stumbled down the stage steps, his head hanging low to hide his weeping face. He could not look at the board members who had just witnessed his total destruction. Bertram was dragged by the collar of his ruined cashmere sweater, his pristine loafers scuffing against the carpet. He was blubbering nonsense and trying to hide his face from the staring crowd. Priscilla was forced to her feet and marched alongside them, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The entire grand ballroom watched in total silence as the fake aristocratic family was escorted out into the cold night. They were leaving the luxurious hotel in steel handcuffs, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth and their fabricated dignity. I stood tall at the podium, watching the heavy mahogany doors close firmly behind them. The corporate cancer had been completely excised. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt clean and pure. The federal agents had executed their duties with flawless precision, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The long, brutal war was officially over. I looked out at the silent crowd of executives and investors. They were staring at me with a profound mixture of awe and genuine terror. They finally understood the true cost of betraying the foundation of this company. I adjusted my midnight blue suit and prepared to address my board of directors. The true founder of Sterling Meridian Logistics had entirely reclaimed his stolen empire, and a new era of absolute integrity was about to begin. The grand ballroom began to empty, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence. The terrified corporate elite and wealthy socialites fled through the gilded exit doors, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic federal raid they had just witnessed. The string quartet had packed their instruments and slipped away into the night. The catering staff moved like quiet ghosts, clearing away half-empty crystal champagne flutes and untouched silver platters of caviar. The opulent space, which only an hour ago felt like an untouchable fortress of arrogance, now resembled a hollow and abandoned theater. After the final curtain had dropped, I stood near the edge of the main stage, taking a slow and deep breath. The heavy midnight blue wool of my bespoke suit suddenly felt much lighter on my shoulders. The corporate execution was complete, and the federal authorities were processing the prisoners. But my most important task of the evening was still waiting for me. I turned away from the empty podium and scanned the vast expanse of the polished marble floor. I found her standing near the massive mahogany doors at the very back of the room. Adeline looked incredibly small in the cavernous space. She was wearing a simple dark dress that contrasted sharply with the extravagant gowns the other women had flaunted all evening. She was gripping the edge of a velvet-draped cocktail table, her knuckles completely white. Even from a distance, I could see that her shoulders were trembling. She had watched the entire spectacle unfold from the shadows. She had witnessed the absolute destruction of her husband's false empire and the shocking revelation of her father's true identity. The foundation of her reality had been violently shattered and rearranged in the span of 30 minutes. I stepped down from the stage and began to walk across the ballroom floor. My leather shoes made a soft, rhythmic sound against the marble, carrying me toward my only daughter. As I drew closer, Adeline slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were wide and filled with a swirling mixture of shock, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of awe. She looked at my tailored suit and the undeniable posture of authority I now carried. For her entire life, she had known me as a quiet, unpretentious man who worked with his hands and preferred the smell of cedar sawdust over expensive cologne. She had watched me endure the relentless condescension of her husband and his arrogant parents without ever raising my voice. Now she was looking at the absolute majority shareholder of a multinational corporation, the man who had just dismantled a fraudulent dynasty with a single command. I stopped a few feet away from her. I did not speak immediately. I simply opened my arms. Adeline let out a soft, breathless sound and closed the distance between us. She collapsed against my chest, burying her face in the dark wool of my jacket. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a fierce and protective embrace. I held her with the same desperate strength I used when she was a little girl, waking up from a terrible nightmare. I felt the violent trembling in her body begin to subside as she leaned into my solid frame. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the hotel ballroom melted away, leaving only the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. Adeline gripped the lapels of my jacket, her tears soaking into the expensive fabric. She pulled back slightly and looked up into my eyes. She told me she finally understood everything. She whispered that the missing pieces of the puzzle had suddenly slammed into place. She realized the depth of the horrific deceit Wesley had woven around her. She understood that his sudden romantic interest, his rushed marriage proposal, and his constant attempts to isolate her were all carefully calculated steps in a predatory financial scheme. He had never loved her. He had only loved the proximity to power and the potential access to a fortune he thought he could steal. Adeline voiced this terrible realization with a trembling voice, but her eyes were clear. The toxic illusion of her marriage was completely broken. I kept my hands resting gently on her shoulders, anchoring her to reality. I knew I owed her a profound explanation for the deception I had maintained for so many years. I spoke to her in a quiet and steady voice, ensuring every word carried the absolute weight of my love. I told her that building a massive corporate empire brings a very specific and dangerous type of visibility. It attracts parasites and opportunists who measure human value entirely by bank accounts and stock options. When her mother passed away and I was left to raise her alone, I made a solemn vow to protect her from that toxic, artificial world. I explained that I hid the wealth and stepped away from the public executive role because I wanted her to grow up grounded in reality. I wanted her to value hard work, honesty, and genuine human connection. Most importantly, I wanted her to be loved entirely for the brilliant and beautiful person she was, and not for the size of a hidden trust fund. I needed her to navigate the world without the corrupting shadow of a massive inheritance hanging over her every relationship. I told Adeline that true wealth is invisible. It is not found in diamond necklaces, luxury yachts, or imported champagne. It is found in character and integrity. I wanted her to build a life based on those solid principles. But in my desperate attempt to shield her from the darkness of the corporate world, I had inadvertently left a blind spot. I lowered my head and offered my daughter a sincere and heavy apology. I apologized for letting a parasite like Wesley infiltrate our lives and manipulate her trust. I told her how deeply sorry I was for the pain he had caused her, and for the tears she had shed in our kitchen just a few nights ago. I had been so focused on maintaining the illusion of a simple life that I allowed a predator to cross our threshold. I promised her that it was my greatest failure as a father, and a mistake I would never repeat. I wiped a stray tear from her cheek with my thumb. I looked deep into her eyes and made her an absolute promise. I told her that she was completely and permanently free. The legal trap was closed, and the federal authorities had removed the threat. Wesley and his corrupt family would spend the rest of their miserable lives facing the catastrophic consequences of their own boundless greed. They would never cast a shadow over her life again. She was safe, and her future was entirely her own to build. Adeline looked at me, and a profound transformation washed over her face. The lingering fear and betrayal that had haunted her eyes for months completely evaporated. She let out a long, trembling breath and began to cry again. But these were not tears of sadness or grief. They were tears of absolute, overwhelming relief and boundless gratitude. The heavy, suffocating chains of a fraudulent marriage had been shattered. She rested her head against my chest once more, holding me tight. We stood together in the quiet emptiness of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the fading echoes of a destroyed empire. The storm had finally passed, and the air was clear. I held my daughter close, knowing that we had weathered the absolute worst they could throw at us, and we had emerged completely unbroken. 6 months dissolved the illusion of their empire completely. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding certainty that leaves no room for arrogance. Wesley did not endure a lengthy, dramatic trial. His highly paid defense attorneys looked at the mountain of forensic evidence Frank had provided and advised him to surrender immediately. Wesley accepted a federal plea deal for wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate racketeering. The judge showed zero leniency toward a man who had manipulated a corporate trust to steal millions. He was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The transition from the penthouse suite to a concrete cell broke him entirely. He traded his bespoke Italian wool suits for a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. The man who used to command boardrooms with a snap of his fingers now had to ask permission to use the telephone. His days are strictly regulated by the harsh buzzing of prison alarms and the heavy metallic slamming of iron gates. He sleeps on a thin mattress in a tiny cell, surrounded by deafening noise and absolute isolation. He spends every waking hour realizing that his limitless greed was the exact architect of his own permanent cage. Wesley's conviction was the hammer that shattered Bertram and Priscilla's fragile aristocratic facade. The federal authorities did not stop at putting Wesley behind bars. They followed the money trail directly to his parents. The 80-foot luxury yacht docked in Port Salvara was seized by federal marshals and auctioned off to compensate the blind trust. The fleet of imported luxury cars was towed away from their massive driveway in the middle of the night. The bank accounts they had used to fund their extravagant lifestyle were completely frozen and drained by the government. The millions of dollars they believed were rightfully theirs vanished into thin air, leaving them with absolutely nothing. The federal racketeering laws allowed the government to confiscate every single asset tied to the embezzled funds. Bertram and Priscilla watched in pure, helpless terror as federal agents boxed up their expensive art, their designer clothes, and their stolen jewelry. The empire they thought they had secured through their son's deception evaporated, leaving them entirely exposed to the harsh reality of their own profound incompetence. The loss of their stolen wealth was devastating, but the social execution was far more painful for Priscilla. The elite circles of high society operate on a ruthless set of rules. The moment the news of Wesley's federal indictment hit the morning papers, Bertram and Priscilla were instantly and permanently excommunicated. The country club memberships they had flaunted were immediately revoked. The invitations to charity galas and exclusive dinners completely stopped arriving. Priscilla tried to call her wealthy friends, desperate for a sympathetic ear or a temporary loan. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The women who used to drink expensive champagne with her now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Bertram found himself equally isolated. The prominent businessmen and politicians he used to play golf with pretended they had never met him. The aristocratic community they had spent years trying to infiltrate cast them out like a contagious disease. They had no genuine friends because they had built their entire social network on a foundation of lies and stolen money. Without the illusion of wealth, they were completely invisible. With their assets seized and their bank accounts drained, Bertram and Priscilla were violently forced out of their sprawling suburban mansion. They had no savings to fall back on, and no marketable skills to generate income. They were reduced to the very demographic they had mocked and despised their entire lives. They found a cramped, unheated one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The building was old and crumbling, surrounded by cracked pavement and rusted chain-link fences. There was no polished marble in the lobby. There were no valet attendants or private security guards. The tiny kitchen featured peeling linoleum floors and a refrigerator that constantly rattled. Priscilla could no longer spend her afternoons shopping at high-end boutiques. She was forced to clip paper coupons and calculate the cost of generic brand groceries. She had to learn how to ride the public bus because they could not afford a vehicle. The designer silk dresses she loved so much were replaced by cheap, practical clothing meant to keep her warm in the drafty apartment. The stark contrast between her former life and her current reality was a daily, agonizing punishment. Bertram struggled to comprehend his new existence. He had spent his entire adult life acting like a titan of industry without ever putting in the actual labor. Now the harsh reality of poverty demanded action he was completely incapable of providing. The unpaid utility bills piled up on their tiny, scratched dining table. With Wesley locked away in a federal prison, there was no one left to steal for them. Bertram was forced to swallow his massive pride and search for employment. At 60 years old, with a ruined reputation and no verifiable skills, his options were brutally limited. The man who used to sneer at service workers from the deck of a stolen yacht now had to submit applications for entry-level retail positions. Store managers looked at his blank resume and dismissed him instantly. The irony was absolute and unforgiving. He spent his days sitting in the cold, drafty apartment, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the walls. The constant, gnawing fear of eviction replaced the arrogant confidence he used to project. He had built his entire identity around being better than the working class, and now he was drowning in the very struggles he used to laugh at. The physical discomfort of their new life was terrible, but the psychological torment was absolute. The cramped walls of the cheap apartment forced Bertram and Priscilla to confront each other every single minute of the day. There was no massive estate to hide in. There was no expensive wine to dull the pain. The resentment between them began to boil over into bitter, endless arguments. Bertram blamed Priscilla for pushing Wesley to steal more money, to fund her extravagant tastes. Priscilla screamed at Bertram for being a weak, pathetic man who could not provide for his family without relying on criminal behavior. They turned into vicious enemies, trapped together in a cage of their own making. The gradually increasing conflict between them consumed whatever was left of their marriage. They had nothing but blame and hatred to share. Their son was gone. Their stolen wealth was gone. Their fake friends were gone. They were left completely alone in the freezing outskirts of the city to tear each other apart. They learned the hardest lesson of all in that tiny, unheated apartment. True wealth is built on a foundation of honest labor and genuine integrity. A castle built on lies and stolen money will always eventually collapse. They had spent years looking down on quiet, honest men. They had believed that kindness was a weakness to be exploited. They had thought they could manipulate their way into a permanent dynasty. The absolute ruin they now faced was the direct mathematical result of their own unchecked greed. There was no chance of redemption. There was no secret bank account waiting to save them. The justice delivered to them was absolute and permanent. The inescapable poverty they woke up to every single morning was a perfect mirror reflecting the complete emptiness of their souls. They were forced to live out the rest of their days paying the brutal, agonizing price for their supreme arrogance. The early morning air was crisp and completely still. I sat on the worn wooden steps of my front porch, holding a chipped ceramic mug in both hands. The wood beneath me was old and weathered. It bore the marks of decades of seasons changing, and the countless times my boots had scraped against its surface. I took a slow sip of the dark, bitter liquid. It was cheap, store-bought coffee, brewed strong, just the way I had liked it for the past 40 years. I watched the first pale light of dawn begin to bleed over the horizon, painting the quiet suburban street in soft shades of blue and gray. The neighborhood was just starting to wake up. Across the street, Mrs. Thornberry was walking her golden retriever in her thick wool coat. The newspaper delivery truck turned the corner, its tires rolling softly over the damp asphalt. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in a perfectly ordinary neighborhood. No one looking at me sitting on this peeling porch in my faded flannel shirt would ever suspect the magnitude of the wealth I controlled, and that was exactly how I wanted it to remain. The screen door squeaked softly behind me. Adeline stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing an oversized knitted sweater and holding her own steaming mug of coffee. She did not say a single word. She simply walked down the steps and sat right beside me, pulling her knees up to her chest. I looked at my daughter. The dark circles that had bruised the skin under her eyes for months were completely gone. The constant, trembling tension that had gripped her shoulders during her miserable marriage to Wesley had entirely vanished. She looked rested, she looked healthy. Most importantly, she looked entirely at peace. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the cool morning air, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. We did not need to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. The quiet between us was no longer heavy with secrets or unsaid fears. It was a comfortable, warm silence, built on a foundation of absolute truth and restored trust. Adeline leaned her head against my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. Over the past 6 months, she had moved back into her childhood bedroom. We had spent countless hours sitting at the old kitchen table, talking through the pain and rebuilding the bond that Wesley had tried so desperately to sever. She had asked me once, shortly after the trial, why I did not want to move. She had seen the bank statements. She knew I could purchase any sprawling estate in the most exclusive zip codes on earth. I could have bought a fleet of luxury vehicles or a private jet. I told her the exact same thing I had told myself for years. A house is simply a structure made of wood and glass, but a home is a living repository of human memory. I built this house with my own hands. I carried her mother over this very threshold. I marked Adeline's height on the wooden doorframe in the kitchen every single summer until she left for college. No amount of corporate capital could ever purchase that kind of history. Moving into a sterile, cavernous mansion would not elevate my life. It would only erase the beautiful, grounded reality I had spent decades cultivating. The wealth I commanded was no longer a hidden burden. It had returned to its proper function. It was simply a tool. Back in the towering glass headquarters of Sterling Meridian Logistics, the corporate atmosphere had completely transformed. The toxic culture of greed and ruthless ambition that Wesley had fostered was entirely eradicated. Frank and I had carefully selected a new executive board comprised of honest, pragmatic leaders who valued sustainable growth and ethical business practices. The company was thriving again. The profits were no longer being siphoned into offshore shell companies to fund the arrogant lifestyles of parasites. The dividends were being reinvested into the employees and into the future. I did not need to sit in the corner office to know my empire was secure. Frank handled the daily legalities of the blind trust with his usual predatory efficiency. I remained the absolute majority shareholder, but I operated entirely from the shadows, guiding the ship without ever needing to stand at the helm. The billions of dollars sitting in those protected accounts were no longer a secret I had to guard with my life. They were a silent, impenetrable shield. I had established an ironclad legal structure to ensure Adeline would be protected for the rest of her existence. The money would never define her. It would never again attract predators looking for an easy mark. It would simply sit quietly in the background, acting as an invisible fortress against any hardship the world might throw at her. She was currently working part-time at a local community center, finding genuine purpose in helping others. She was discovering who she was, outside the shadow of a controlling husband and outside the blinding glare of high society. She was learning that true value comes from the work you do and the kindness you show, not the brand of the clothes on your back. The sun finally crested the horizon. Brilliant rays of gold and orange spilled across the suburban lawns, lighting up the dewdrops on the grass like thousands of tiny scattered diamonds. A gentle breeze ruffled the leaves of the old oak tree in our front yard. I took another sip of my cheap, bitter coffee. I felt a profound settling deep within my chest. The agonizing war was a distant memory. The violent storm that had threatened to consume my family had been decisively broken. The people who had tried to manipulate and destroy us were currently waking up to the harsh, metallic reality of their own inescapable consequences. They were rotting in prison cells and freezing in cramped apartments, paying the ultimate price for their boundless arrogance. But here, on this worn wooden porch, there was only safety. Order had been permanently restored. The dignity of my family remained completely intact. I looked at the quiet street, and then down at my daughter, resting peacefully against my side. I realized that the greatest victory was not the destruction of my enemies or the reclaiming of a massive corporate empire. The greatest victory was simply being able to sit here on a quiet morning, watching the sunrise with the person I loved most in the world. I did not need to wear a bespoke suit or command a room full of terrified executives to prove my worth. The billionaire founder of Sterling Meridian Logistics was perfectly content, wearing a faded flannel shirt and drinking coffee from a chipped mug. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the morning sun wash over my face. I knew then, with absolute crystalline certainty, that true power never needs to shout. True power simply exists, silent and unshakable, in the quiet peace of a life well lived. The profound lesson woven throughout this ordeal is that true value can never be measured by financial status or social prestige. Wealth, when used as a weapon of arrogance, inevitably destroys the very people who wield it. Real power lies in quiet integrity, unwavering patience, and the strength to protect the people we love from manipulation. We must never confuse a polished exterior with a pure heart, nor should we ever mistake kindness for weakness. Ultimately, the strongest foundation a family can build is one of honesty, where love is freely given, without hidden agendas or selfish calculations. If you found yourself inspired by this story of justice and quiet strength, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below.